My name is Weston Voss, a hurricane hunter who predicted the zombie outbreak weeks before it happened. Nobody believed me. They called me paranoid as I stockpiled supplies and monitored strange atmospheric patterns from my rooftop. Then the screams started. Now I broadcast from this radio tower outside Austin, using my weather expertise to track zombie movements and keep what's left of humanity alive. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Before I tell you how I got here, you should know who I am. My name is Weston Voss. For nearly 15 years, I was a hurricane hunter and meteorological engineer with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I spent my career flying directly into the most powerful storms on Earth, gathering data that helped predict their paths and intensity. Most people run from danger. I flew straight into it. Hurricane hunting isn't just about bravery or thrill-seeking. It's about precision, measurement, and understanding patterns that others miss. We would fly modified Lockheed WP-3D Orion aircraft, equipped with specialized radar and weather instruments right through the eye wall of hurricanes, the most violent part of the storm, to reach the eerily calm center. Then we'd do it again, from different angles, collecting data that satellites simply can't provide. My specific role combined flying with designing and maintaining the equipment we used to gather that data. I created instruments that could function in conditions that would destroy standard electronics. My colleagues started calling me Weatherman. Not very original, I know. But the nickname has taken on a whole new meaning now. I'm recording this from an abandoned radio tower about 30 miles outside what used to be Austin, Texas. It's been 6 months since the outbreak began. 6 months since civilization collapsed. 6 months since the dead started walking. But the signs were there weeks before anyone noticed. That's what keeps me up at night. I saw it coming, and no one would listen. 3 months before the outbreak, I began noticing unusual atmospheric patterns in our global weather data. Barometric pressure fluctuations that didn't match any models we'd established over decades of research. At first, I thought it might be equipment malfunction, but the readings were consistent across multiple systems and locations. The atmosphere was behaving like it does before a supercell forms, but on a global scale, something I'd never seen in all my years of studying extreme weather. I brought my concerns to my superiors at NOAA. They dismissed it as routine fluctuations or statistical anomalies. When I persisted, showing them my calculations and projections, they suggested I take some time off, said I was overworked from too many hurricane seasons. One of them even joked that I'd been flying through too many storm systems and the turbulence had rattled my brain. That's when I decided to set up my own monitoring equipment. I lived on the 17th floor of an apartment building near downtown Austin. The rooftop access was supposedly restricted, but I'd made friends with the maintenance staff. They looked the other way while I installed a compact weather station with barometers, anemometers, a thermohygrograph, and other instruments I'd either borrowed from work or built myself. Every day after my shift at NOAA, I'd check my equipment, record the readings, and compare them to the official data. The discrepancies grew larger each week. I was measuring barometric pressure drops unlike anything I'd seen outside of Category 5 hurricanes, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Something was happening to our atmosphere that defied all established meteorological principles. Around this time, I also began preparing for what I knew would be some kind of catastrophic event. Working in disaster response with NOAA had taught me the value of preparation. I'd seen too many people lose everything because they weren't ready when the storm hit. I began stockpiling non-perishable food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, batteries, and other essentials. I converted my second bedroom into what my few friends jokingly called my doomsday chamber. They laughed, but that preparation saved my life. In hurricane work, we have a saying, it's not paranoia if the storm is really coming. By early July 2023, the atmospheric anomalies had become so pronounced that I took emergency leave from NOAA. My colleagues thought I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I was. But I knew something was wrong with the world, even if I couldn't yet identify what it was. I spent almost all my time on that rooftop, monitoring my equipment, watching for visible signs that might correlate with the invisible atmospheric changes I was detecting. In hurricane hunting, we learn to recognize what we call the deceptive calm, that eerily peaceful period that sometimes precedes the most violent storms. The morning of July 17th was like that. Clear blue skies, mild temperature, light breeze. Perfect, really. Except my instruments were going crazy. The barometric pressure was fluctuating wildly, dropping and rising in patterns that made no meteorological sense. I was on the roof at dawn, recalibrating my equipment, convinced it must be malfunctioning despite repeated checks. That's when I first noticed something odd in the streets below. The early morning traffic pattern was disrupted. Cars stopped at green lights. A city bus halted mid-route, passengers spilling out onto the sidewalk. People were running, but from what, I couldn't tell from 17 stories up. I grabbed my binoculars, another tool of the trade for hurricane hunters. We use them to observe wall clouds and storm formations from a distance. That morning, I used them to witness the beginning of the end. At first, I thought I was seeing some kind of riot. A man in a business suit was attacking a woman near a bus stop, biting at her like an animal. Then I saw it happening elsewhere, outside a coffee shop in the middle of an intersection, inside the lobby of an office building visible through its glass facade. Scattered incidents that quickly multiplied. I watched, transfixed with horror and scientific curiosity, as the pattern emerged. The victims of these attacks would collapse, remain motionless for varying periods, usually between 2 and 8 minutes based on my observations, and then rise again, joining the attackers. The transformation was methodical, almost mechanical, nothing like the panicked chaos of a riot or mass hysteria event. I'd spent my career predicting destructive forces of nature, but nothing prepared me for this. This was something new, something worse than any hurricane or tornado. At least storms follow rules, laws of physics and thermodynamics. This defied explanation. I rushed back to my apartment and turned on the television. Every channel had breaking, news banners, reports of mass casualty incidents throughout Austin and similar events in other major cities. The initial reports called it a riot, then mass hysteria, then a rage-inducing pathogen. By mid-morning, medical experts on the news were using terms like viral encephalitis with aggressive tendencies. By noon, they stopped using scientific terminology. A visibly shaken reporter on a local station, broadcasting from what looked like a closet rather than a studio, was the first I heard use the word we all now know too well. "These aren't sick people," she said, her voice breaking. "They're zombies, the walking dead. They've taken over downtown. If you're watching this, stay inside, barricade your doors. Don't let anyone in, not even family. Especially not family who might be infected." That was the last broadcast from that station. Others followed, each falling silent in turn as their facilities were overrun. The final TV transmission I saw was from the emergency broadcast system, announcing military containment efforts in evacuation centers. It cut off mid-message. My satellite phone still worked, another piece of equipment hurricane hunters carry to maintain communications when normal networks fail. I tried calling my colleagues at NOAA, my family in Oklahoma, anyone I could think of who might be safe or might have answers. Most calls didn't connect. Those that did revealed similar situations unfolding across the country. My sister in Tulsa had 10 minutes to tell me what was happening there before she had to flee her home. I never heard from her again. As information networks collapsed, I became a dedicated observer of the chaos engulfing Austin. From my apartment window, I could see military helicopters evacuating people from the roof of the state capitol building. I watched as the soldiers tried to establish a quarantine zone downtown, using vehicles as barricades. They were overrun within hours. One helicopter crashed into the Capitol dome after its pilot was attacked mid-flight, sending a black plume of smoke across the skyline that lingered for days. Inside my building, I could hear the infection spreading, screams from the lower floors, pounding footsteps in the stairwells, breaking glass and splintering wood as doors were forced open. I methodically reinforced my own door with furniture, sealed the air vents, and took inventory of my supplies. I had enough food and water to last about 2 weeks if I rationed carefully. I still had power, which was surprising, but I knew it wouldn't last. That first night, the city's power grid began to fail in sections. I watched as Austin went dark in patches, like a virus spreading through a body, which I suppose is exactly what was happening. By morning, only scattered areas still had electricity, mainly around government buildings and hospitals. My building was on the same grid as a nearby medical center, so we still had power, but it was unstable, flickering on and off. I used the remaining power to charge all my devices and continue monitoring both my weather equipment and the nightmare below. The infected, I still hesitated to call them zombies then, still clinging to scientific rationality, moved differently from living humans. They lacked purpose or coordination individually, but in groups, they formed something like currents or flows, similar to how wind patterns develop in storm systems. As a meteorologist, I couldn't help but document these patterns. I began mapping their movements on the city grid, noting concentrations and flow directions. It was something to focus on, something to maintain my sanity in those first terrifying days. And it revealed something important. They weren't entirely random. They reacted to stimuli, primarily sound and movement, and tended to cluster in areas where more potential victims might be found. The fires started on the second day. With no firefighters to respond, they spread unchecked. I tracked them just as I once tracked weather systems, calculating wind direction and speed, identifying high-risk areas where the blazes would likely intensify or merge. From my high vantage point, I could see the entire disaster unfolding like a slow-motion hurricane of fire and death. By the third day, the situation in my building had deteriorated drastically. The power finally failed completely. The water pressure dropped to a trickle before stopping, and the infected had reached the upper floors. I could hear them in the hallway outside my apartment, testing doors, responding to any sound with increased aggression. That morning I heard screaming from across the hall. Mrs. Garcia, an elderly woman who had refused evacuation because her mobility issues made it too difficult. Her door gave way with a splintering crash. Her scream stopped abruptly moments later. I knew my barricade wouldn't hold much longer. I had to move. 17 flights of stairs through an infected building wasn't ideal, but I had no choice. I packed only what I could carry. My satellite phone, multi-tool, first aid kit, water purification tablets, maps, and a few of my weather instruments. Some people might think it strange that I prioritized a barometer and anemometer during the apocalypse, but somehow I knew they'd still matter in this new world. Perhaps more than ever. I waited by my door, listening as the infected that had taken Mrs. Garcia moved away, drawn by some other sound in the building. Then I slipped out into the hallway, headed for the stairwell, and began my descent through hell. Every detail of that first morning remains seared into my memory. Through my binoculars, I watched as a woman in a blue business suit, she'd been checking her phone while walking, suddenly lunged at a mail carrier sorting packages at his truck. At first I thought it was some kind of argument or assault. Then I saw her teeth sink into his neck. The carrier dropped his packages, struggled briefly, then collapsed. The woman immediately moved on to another pedestrian, not even stopping, to see if the carrier was dead. What happened next defied everything I understood about life and death. The mail carrier lay motionless for approximately 3 minutes. I timed it, the scientist in me already documenting even in my shock. Then his limbs began to twitch. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated as he rose to his feet. Blood still pumped from the wound in his neck, but he seemed unaffected by what should have been a fatal injury. He turned, sniffed the air almost, like an animal, and then joined the businesswoman in attacking others. I shifted my binoculars across the cityscape, discovering that this wasn't an isolated incident. Outside the coffee shop where I usually grabbed breakfast, the barista who knew my order by heart was biting chunks from a customer's arm. In the park 2 blocks over, a morning jogger was being overwhelmed by what appeared to be an entire infected family. Through the glass facade of the bank across the street, I could see similar violence erupting in the lobby. The transformation followed the same pattern each time: attack, collapse, reanimation, then immediately joining the attackers. No confusion, no disorientation, just predatory purpose. They moved in patterns, not random like panicked humans, but flowing like currents. In a storm system, I'd been trained to observe and document during hurricanes, maintaining scientific objectivity even as 100-mile-per-hour winds buffeted our aircraft. That training took over. I began taking notes, recording times, documenting the spread pattern. Part of me was still in denial, searching for a rational explanation for what couldn't possibly be happening. A toxic gas release? Mass hallucination? Some kind of coordinated terrorist attack? But I'd spent enough time studying natural phenomena to recognize one when I saw it. This was something primordial, something that followed its own natural laws. Whatever it was, it spread with the efficiency and inevitability of a storm system, but with intelligence, however rudimentary. I rushed back to my apartment and turned on every news channel I could find. The early reports were predictably confused. A riot in downtown Austin, multiple assailants attacking civilians, police responding to mass casualty incidents throughout the city. Standard crisis language that utterly failed to capture what was happening. By mid-morning, the terminology had evolved. Medical experts were being interviewed, speculating about rage-inducing pathogens and viral encephalitis with aggressive tendencies. They compared it to rabies, to various tropical diseases, to obscure neurological conditions. They were grasping at scientific explanations because the truth was too horrific to acknowledge. It was a local reporter, Jessica Chen from Channel 8, who finally said what we were all thinking. Broadcasting from what looked like a supply closet, hair disheveled, blood spatter visible on her blouse, she abandoned journalistic objectivity and simply told the truth. "I know this sounds crazy," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "But these aren't sick people. They're zombies. The Walking Dead. They've taken over our station. Most of my colleagues are gone. If you're watching this, stay inside. Barricade your doors. Don't let anyone in, not even family. Especially not family who might be infected." The camera shook, and there was a sound of something heavy hitting a door. Chen looked over her shoulder, then back at the camera. "They're attracted to sound and movement. Stay quiet. Stay still when they're near. If you have to move, be somewhere else before they realize you're gone." The feed cut to static moments later. Other stations followed similar trajectories, each falling silent in turn. The emergency broadcast system took over, announcing military containment efforts and evacuation centers. The flat, automated voice seemed absurdly calm given the circumstances. "Proceed to designated evacuation centers. Follow all military personnel instructions. Do not attempt to bring infected individuals for treatment." The message repeated for about 20 minutes before it too cut off mid-sentence. I tried using my satellite phone to contact my colleagues at NOAA, wondering if the atmospheric anomalies I'd been tracking had been detected by others, if there might be some connection to what was happening. Most calls failed to connect. The few that did revealed similar situations unfolding across the country. Dr. Ramirez in our Miami office had 10 seconds to tell me that South Florida was completely overrun before I heard screaming, and the line went dead. My former mentor at the Oklahoma City Weather Center reported that the military was attempting to establish a safe zone there, but wasn't optimistic about their chances. My sister in Tulsa described barricading herself in her attic with her children, whispering so the infected roaming her house below wouldn't hear them. As communications networks collapsed one by one, I became solely reliant on what I could observe directly. From my apartment window, I had a clear view of the government district. The Texas state capitol had become an evacuation point, with military helicopters landing on the grounds to extract officials and civilians. I watched as soldiers tried to establish a perimeter, using vehicles as barricades and firing at any infected that approached. For a few hours, it seemed like they might succeed in creating a safe zone. Then I saw it happen, a helicopter landing. To pick up evacuees, someone in the crowd turning, attacking others in the packed group. The infection spread through the evacuation point like wildfire. The soldiers were overwhelmed within minutes, their defensive line collapsing as the infected flooded through. Some of the soldiers turned as well, their military training making them even more dangerous as infected. One helicopter pilot was attacked during takeoff. The aircraft spun out of control and crashed into the Capitol dome, exploding on impact. The historic building burned for days, black smoke billowing into the sky. It became a marker, visible for miles, the funeral pyre of the old world. Inside my building, the infection spread floor by floor. I could track its progress by the sounds, screaming from the lower levels, then pounding footsteps in the stairwells as people fled upward, thinking height would save them. Breaking glass as windows were smashed by those desperate enough to consider jumping. Splintering wood as doors were forced open by either the infected or by neighbors seeking refuge. I methodically reinforced my own door, dragging every piece of heavy furniture I had against it. I sealed the air vents with duct tape, uncertain whether the infection could spread that way. I took inventory of my supplies, 15 gallons of water, canned food for about 2 weeks if rationed carefully, a first aid kit, batteries, flashlights, a portable radio, and my weather equipment. That first night, the power began to fail across the city. From my window, I watched Austin go dark in sections. The blackout spread like a slow-moving wave, neighborhood by neighborhood. By midnight, only scattered areas still had electricity, mainly around government buildings and hospitals. My building was on the same grid as a nearby medical center, so we still had power, but it was unstable, flickering on and off. I used the remaining electricity to charge all my devices and continued monitoring both my weather equipment and the situation below. Without streetlights, the city was transformed. Fires provided the only illumination, casting an apocalyptic glow over the urban landscape. The infected were visible as moving shadows flowing through streets like dark water finding the path of least resistance. As a hurricane hunter, I'd been trained to find patterns in chaos. I couldn't help applying that training now. I began mapping the movements of the infected on a city grid I had in my apartment, noting concentrations and flow directions. It was something to focus on, something to maintain my sanity in those first terrifying days. The pattern that emerged was enlightening. The infected weren't moving randomly. They clustered where buildings created wind tunnels and natural funnels for movement, just like debris in a storm. They followed paths of least resistance, gathered in open areas where potential victims might be found, and reacted primarily to sound and movement. Understanding this might be the key to navigating safely when I inevitably had to leave. By the second day, fires had broken out across the city. A gas station explosion near the university. An apartment complex south of the river. The Capitol building still smoldering. With no firefighters to respond, the blazes spread unchecked. I tracked them using the same principles I'd apply to a wildfire or storm system, calculating wind direction and speed, identifying high-risk areas. From my high vantage point, I could see the entire disaster unfolding like a slow-motion hurricane. The fires created their own weather system, smoke plumes rising, cooling, creating downdrafts that spread the flames in unpredictable patterns. Under different circumstances, it would have been fascinating from a meteorological perspective. Now it was just another threat to navigate. The water pressure in my building began to drop by the afternoon of the second day. I filled every container I had, pots, bottles, the bathtub, knowing the supply might not last. By evening, the taps produced only a trickle before stopping completely. The power followed a few hours later, the building going dark as the hospital finally lost its emergency generators. In the sudden silence that followed, no air conditioning, no refrigerator hum, no electronic background noise, I could hear everything happening in the building with alarming clarity. Footsteps in the hallway, moaning from the floors below. The occasional scream quickly silenced, the scratching of fingers on doors as the infected tested each one, seeking prey. I sat in darkness, my back against the barricaded door, listening as the world I knew disintegrated around me. The scientist in me still observed, still analyzed, even as the human in me struggled with terror and grief. I had predicted a catastrophe, but nothing like this. My atmospheric readings had warned of something coming, but how could anyone have anticipated the dead rising? By the third morning, the situation had deteriorated beyond sustainability. The heat in my apartment had become nearly unbearable without air conditioning. The food in my refrigerator was spoiling, creating an odor I worried might attract the infected. And worst of all, they had reached my floor. I heard Mrs. Garcia first, my elderly neighbor across the hall who had declined evacuation. When it was still possible, she had mobility issues that made stairs difficult, and she'd insisted she would wait for her son to come for her. I'd tried to convince her otherwise, even offered to help her leave, but she was adamant. Now I heard her door giving way with a splintering crash, her screams abruptly silenced moments later. I knew my barricade wouldn't hold much longer. The infected seemed to be growing more aggressive, more determined in their efforts to break through doors. Perhaps they were learning, or perhaps hunger was driving them to greater ferocity. Either way, I had to move before I was trapped. 17 flights of stairs through an infected building wasn't ideal, but I had no alternative. I packed only what I could carry in a backpack and shoulder bag: my satellite phone, multi-tool, first aid kit, water purification tablets, maps, a few days' worth of food, and several of my smaller weather instruments. Some might think it strange that I prioritized a barometer and anemometer during the apocalypse, but my scientific training had kept me alive so far. Perhaps understanding the natural world would continue to provide an advantage. I stood by my door, ear pressed against it, listening as the infected that had taken Mrs. Garcia moved away, drawn by some other disturbance in the building. When the hallway fell silent, I quietly removed the furniture forming my barricade, trying not to make even the slightest sound. The final piece, my heavy oak dining table, I moved with agonizing slowness, lowering it to the floor without a thud. With my backpack secured and shoulder bag in place, I took one last look at the apartment that had been my home and observation post for the past 3 days. The weather station I'd built, now useless without power. The maps covered in my notations tracking the spread of fire and infection. The empty water containers. The barometer that had first warned me something was wrong with the world. I turned the doorknob slowly, degree by degree, until the latch released. Then I slipped into the hallway, closed the door silently behind me, and faced the new reality of a world overrun by the dead. The corridor was dim, illuminated only by emergency lighting running on backup batteries. At the far end, I could see Mrs. Garcia's door, splintered and hanging from its hinges. Blood smeared the doorframe and walls. I moved in the opposite direction, toward the stairwell, placing each foot carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. I reached the stairs without incident and began my descent into what felt increasingly like a journey into the underworld. Each floor presented its own tableau of horror. On the 16th floor, a body lay sprawled in the stairwell, head at an unnatural angle, suggesting a fatal fall. I stepped carefully around it, noticing with scientific detachment that it hadn't reanimated. Perhaps a broken neck prevented the transformation. The 15th floor door was barricaded from the stairwell side, someone's failed attempt to prevent the infected from spreading upward. The 14th was worse. The door hung open, and through it I could see infected roaming the hallway. I froze, watching their movement patterns. They seemed aimless until a crash somewhere in the building caused them all to turn simultaneously, in that direction. I waited until they moved toward the sound, then continued my descent. On the 8th floor I encountered Mr. Diaz, the building superintendent, or what remained of him. He'd been kind to me, allowing me roof access for my weather equipment when it was technically against building policy. Now he was something else entirely, his maintenance uniform soaked with blood, his normally friendly face transformed into a mask of mindless hunger. He was alone in the stairwell, pawing at the 8th floor door that had closed and latched, trapping him there. When he sensed my presence, he turned with frightening speed. I had a split-second decision to make: try to slip past him or retreat upward. The narrowness of the stairs worked in my favor. I pressed against the rail as he lunged, his movements clumsy enough that I was able to sidestep and continue downward, as he struggled to turn in the confined space. The lobby level presented the greatest challenge. Through the small safety glass window in the stairwell door, I could see at least a dozen infected milling about the once elegant entrance area. The front doors stood open, shattered during the initial chaos, meaning I would have to cross the exposed lobby to reach the street. I sat on the stairs, catching my breath and considering my options. Direct confrontation was suicide. Attempting to sneak through seemed equally dangerous given the number of infected and the open space offering nowhere to hide. I needed a distraction. In my bag, I had a small weather radio that still had battery life. It wasn't ideal, but it might draw enough attention to create an opportunity. I set the volume to maximum, turned it on to white noise static, and prepared to throw it as far from my exit path as possible. Taking a deep breath, I cracked open the stairwell door. The infected nearest to me turned at the sound, but before they could approach, I threw the radio across the lobby toward the building's mailroom. The clattering device and its burst of static noise drew every infected in the lobby toward it. I slipped out, hugging the wall, moving as quickly as I dared toward the shattered front doors and the uncertain freedom beyond. Stepping outside was like entering an alien world. The Austin I knew had vanished in just 3 days. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, some still containing their former occupants, now transformed. Bodies lay where they had fallen, those with head injuries remaining still while others had already joined the ranks of the infected. The air was thick with smoke from the uncontrolled fires, creating an eerie fog that limited visibility and stung my eyes and lungs. My first instinct was to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the infected in the lobby, who would soon lose interest in the radio. But my training as a hurricane hunter had taught me that panic leads to fatal mistakes. Instead, I forced myself to pause, to assess, to plan. I needed to understand this new environment as thoroughly as I had once understood storm systems. The streets were like rivers now, with currents of infected flowing through them. The main thoroughfares were the most dangerous, channeling the largest concentrations of the dead. Side streets offered better routes but less visibility and more potential for ambush. Alleyways were tempting but often ended in fences or walls that would leave me trapped. I chose to move through a mix of side streets and service alleys, paralleling Congress Avenue but avoiding its exposed spans. My immediate goal was simply to get clear of downtown, to reach areas with lower population density where the infected might be more scattered. Movement was the key challenge. Too fast would attract attention, too slow would extend my exposure. I adopted what I called my hurricane pace, deliberate but efficient, like walking on the deck of a ship in heavy seas. It was the same measured movement I used when traversing our aircraft during turbulence. The infected themselves provided valuable data as I navigated. They responded primarily to sound, turning toward any noise with unnerving synchronicity. They were also attracted to movement, but their visual acuity seemed limited. If I remained still when one looked in my direction, it would often lose interest if I'd made no sound. Most importantly, they congregated in predictable patterns. Just like debris in a hurricane follows airflow, the infected followed the path of least resistance through the urban landscape. They pooled in open areas like plazas and parks. They became channeled in narrow streets. They flowed around obstacles rather than attempting to overcome them. Understanding these movements allowed me to anticipate where they would be most concentrated. My first close encounter came as I was working my way down 7th Street. A small group of infected, former office workers based on their tattered business attire emerged from a parking garage just as I was passing. The lead figure, a man whose name tag identified him as Greg from accounting, turned toward me with the jerky motion characteristic of the infected. I froze, controlling my breathing, making myself as silent and still as possible. The group paused, seeming uncertain. Then a car alarm several blocks away activated, likely triggered by fire damage to its electronics. All of the infected immediately turned toward the sound and shambled off in that direction. This confirmed my hypothesis about their sensory priorities. Sound trumped visual stimuli. Movement attracted them, but noise directed them. This information would prove invaluable in the days ahead. I continued moving southeast, working my way toward Lady Bird Lake. Water barriers would limit the directions from which the infected could approach, making defense easier if I could find a secure location near the shoreline. The lake also offered a potential source of water once properly filtered and treated. The closer I got to the water, the more the urban landscape changed. The high-rises gave way to lower buildings, offering less cover but better visibility. The smoke was thinner, here carried northward by the prevailing wind, and most encouragingly, the concentration of infected decreased noticeably. By late afternoon, I reached the north shore of the lake. The hike and bike trail that had once been crowded with joggers and cyclists was largely empty, with only occasional infected wandering aimlessly. The bridges crossing to the south shore were congested with abandoned vehicles and wandering dead, making them impassable. But that also meant fewer infected had made it to this stretch of shoreline. I followed the northern bank eastward, looking for suitable shelter. The ideal location would offer good visibility, multiple escape routes, and defensible entrances. I found it in a waterfront convenience store near the Longhorn Dam. The shop had already been looted, its front windows broken, but the fundamental structure was sound. Most importantly, it had roof access via an external metal staircase, allowing me to climb above the reach of the infected while maintaining a good vantage point. After clearing a few wandering infected from inside with careful maneuvering and well-placed blows to their heads, I secured the back entrance and took stock of what remained in the store. The food was mostly gone, but the looters had overlooked some critical supplies, water purification tablets behind the counter, a first aid kit in the employees' area, and most valuable of all, several maps of the city and surrounding counties. This became my first real shelter after leaving the apartment. I used display shelving to barricade the broken windows, leaving just enough space to slip in and out. The roof became my observation post, offering 360-degree visibility of the surrounding area. I used my anemometer to track wind direction, essential for predicting both weather patterns and the movement of smoke from the fires still burning throughout the city. That first night in the convenience store, I allowed myself to truly rest for the first time since the outbreak began. The relative security and the ability to monitor my surroundings from the roof gave me enough peace of mind to sleep for several hours. When I woke, I began formulating a more comprehensive survival strategy. Water was my first priority. The lake provided an abundant source, but it needed to be purified. I used empty bottles from the store combined with my purification tablets to create a safe supply. Food would soon become an issue, but I still had enough from my apartment for several days if carefully rationed. My longer-term concern was establishing a sustainable shelter. The convenience store was adequate for immediate needs, but its broken windows and urban location made it vulnerable. I needed somewhere more defensible, ideally with potential for growing food and harvesting rainwater. Using the maps I'd found, I began identifying possible locations in the less densely populated areas east of the city. But before I could relocate, I needed to understand more about navigating this new world. For 3 days, I used the convenience store as a base for reconnaissance, venturing out in expanding circles to map the distribution of the infected and identify safe routes. I documented my findings in a small notebook, creating what amounted to a weather map for the zombie apocalypse. The pattern that emerged was consistent with my initial observations. The infected concentrated most heavily in formerly populous areas, shopping centers, apartment complexes, entertainment districts. They thinned out in industrial zones, parks, and residential neighborhoods that had been successfully evacuated. Their movements were heavily influenced by sensory stimuli, but in the absence of such triggers, they tended to wander randomly until something attracted their attention. Most importantly, I began to notice how weather conditions affected their behavior. On the 4th day after leaving my apartment, a cold front moved through the area, dropping temperatures from the high 90s to the low 70s. The change was dramatic, not just in how it felt but in how the infected responded. Their movements became noticeably slower in the cooler air. Their reaction times lengthened. Some seemed almost sluggish, as if their decaying muscles functioned less efficiently in lower temperatures. This was my first indication that weather might provide an advantage beyond just predicting fire movement and rainfall. I began timing their responses under different conditions. In direct sunlight at 98 degrees, an infected would react to a noise within approximately 1.2 seconds. In shade at 73 degrees, that response time extended to nearly 3 seconds. It might not sound significant, but in survival situations, those extra moments could mean the difference between life and death. Armed with this knowledge and my maps marked with infected concentrations, I was ready to leave the temporary shelter of the convenience store. My target was a small garden center in a semi-rural area, about 7 miles east of downtown. It offered several advantages: greenhouse structures that could be secured and used for food production, rainwater collection systems, rural location, with lower infected density, and a second-story office with good visibility. I planned my departure for the early morning hours following a rainy night. The combination of reduced visibility, ambient noise from the rainfall masking my movements, and the observed sluggishness of the infected in wet conditions would provide optimal conditions for travel. The journey took nearly the entire day. I moved carefully from cover to cover, freezing in place whenever infected wandered too close, taking detours around larger concentrations, and using noise distractions when necessary. The suburbs gave way to scattered homes on larger lots, then to small farms and rural properties. With each mile, the density of both structures and infected decreased. The garden center, when I finally reached it, was largely intact. A few infected wandered the parking lot, former employees or customers trapped here when the outbreak hit. Their slow, meandering movements suggested they had been there since the beginning, with no fresh stimuli to excite them into more active states. I observed from hiding for several hours, counting the infected and mapping their movement patterns. There were 7 in total, each following a predictable path around the property. Their routines were so established that they rarely deviated, creating clear gaps I could exploit to approach the main building. Eliminating them directly would have been preferable but represented significant risk. Instead, I created a distraction using my knowledge of their sensory priorities. A battery-operated clock radio placed in a wheelbarrow, set to activate its alarm, drawn them all to the far corner of the property. While they clustered around the noise, I slipped into the main building through a side entrance. The interior was dusty but largely undisturbed. The garden center had been closed when the outbreak hit, a stroke of luck that meant minimal damage and no infected inside. The second-story office provided excellent visibility across the surrounding countryside. The greenhouse structures, while not designed as living quarters, could be adapted with minimal modifications. Most importantly, the rural location meant fewer infected to manage. I secured the building methodically, reinforcing doors and covering windows at ground level. The site had its own well with a hand pump, solving the water problem indefinitely. The greenhouses contained soil, seeds, and all the tools needed to establish food production. Solar-powered security lights, intended to deter thieves, could be repurposed to provide limited electricity. This became my base for the next phase of survival. I established security routines, planting detection systems around the perimeter, simple tripwires attached to cans that would alert me to anything approaching. I began cultivating fast-growing vegetables in one of the smaller greenhouses. I created maps of the surrounding area, marking infected concentrations, resources for scavenging, and potential hazards. Most importantly, I continued my scientific observations. With the garden center as a secure base, I could focus more attention on understanding the nature of the infection and the behavior patterns of the infected. I constructed weather monitoring equipment from materials found in the garden center, a rudimentary but functional system that allowed me to correlate atmospheric conditions with zombie activity levels. The patterns became increasingly clear. The infected were affected by weather conditions in predictable ways. Cold slowed them. Heat made them more aggressive but caused faster decomposition. Heavy rain confused them, washing away scent trails they seemed to use for tracking. Bright sunlight appeared to impair their already limited vision, while darkness eliminated that impairment but made them more reliant on sound and smell. This knowledge became my edge, my advantage in a world where every encounter carried lethal risk. I planned my scavenging expeditions around weather conditions, venturing out during storms when the infected were at their most disoriented. I timed my greenhouse work to coincide with the hottest parts of the day, when the decomposing infected in the area moved to shade, leaving paths temporarily clear. For nearly 2 weeks, the garden center served as both refuge and laboratory. I established routines, improved security, and began the slow process of ensuring longer-term survival. But I never stopped monitoring my weather equipment, and I never stopped observing the atmosphere for the kinds of anomalies that had preceded the outbreak. 17 days after establishing my base at the garden center, I detected something concerning. The barometric pressure began fluctuating in patterns similar to those I'd observed before the outbreak. Not as pronounced, but following the same unnatural rhythms. Something was changing in the atmosphere again, and I needed to understand what it meant for this new world. I needed a better vantage point, more sophisticated equipment, and greater broadcast capability to warn others if necessary. The garden center had served its purpose, but it was time to find something more suitable for this new mission. I needed height, power, and communication capabilities. I needed a radio tower. Using my maps and the knowledge gained through weeks of observation, I identified several potential locations. The most promising was a commercial broadcasting tower approximately 12 miles from my position. It stood on a hill, surrounded by security fencing, with a small operations building at its base. If the equipment inside was intact or repairable, it would provide everything I needed to expand my understanding and potentially reach other survivors. The journey would be risky, 12 miles through territory I hadn't fully scouted, but the weather was turning in my favor. A cold front was moving through, dropping temperatures into the 60s. The infected would be at their slowest, their reactions delayed by the cool air. If I moved carefully and used the behavior patterns I'd documented, I could make it. I packed my essential equipment, harvested what food was ready in the greenhouse, and prepared to embark on the next phase of my post-apocalyptic meteorological research. The atmosphere was changing again, and this time I was determined to understand why, and to make sure others listened before it was too late. The journey to the radio tower took 3 days. I moved only during optimal conditions. Early mornings when the cool night air still lingered, making the infected sluggish, and during a fortunate rainstorm that provided both cover and confusion for the wandering dead. The rest of the time I spent in temporary shelters, a water tower access shed, an abandoned pickup truck with its cab still secure, the attic of a small country church that the infected couldn't reach without functioning fine motor skills to operate the pull-down ladder. Each mile revealed new data about how the infection had spread through rural areas. The distribution wasn't random. Farm communities where people lived in close proximity had been devastated, while isolated properties often showed signs of successful defense or evacuation. Rural roads told stories of failed escape attempts, cars crashed into ditches, belongings scattered where people had fled on foot, the occasional barricade erected by those who hadn't made it. What I hadn't anticipated was how my scientific observations would be confirmed so dramatically during this journey. On the afternoon of the second day, as I was navigating carefully through a small rural subdivision, a cold front moved through the area. The temperature dropped nearly 15 degrees in an hour, and the effect on the infected was immediate and unmistakable. I watched from the concealment of an abandoned school bus as a group of about 20 infected transitioned from active hunting behavior to what I can only describe as a torpid state. Their already awkward movements became almost comically slow. Their reaction times to stimuli extended significantly. Some of the more severely decomposed seemed to struggle to remain upright, as if the cold affected whatever neurological function kept them mobile. This wasn't just a slight change, it was transformative. It was like watching a hurricane downgrade from Category 5 to Category 2 in real time. The threat remained, but its intensity diminished dramatically. I used this opportunity to move more quickly, covering several miles while the cold front maintained its grip on the region. The radio tower came into view late on the third day. It stood on a hillside about half a mile from the nearest road, a slender metal spire rising nearly 300 feet into the air. At its base was a small cinder-block building that likely contained the broadcasting equipment and controls. The entire compound was surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, security measures designed to keep people out that would now serve to keep the infected at bay. I approached cautiously, circling the perimeter to assess both the facility and any potential threats. There were only 3 infected visible within the compound, former technicians or security personnel who had transformed during the initial outbreak. They wandered aimlessly around the tower base, following well-worn paths that suggested they had been repeating the same general movements for weeks. The fence itself was intact except for a small section where a fallen tree branch had bent the top outward. It wasn't a breach, but it created a potential entry point that wouldn't require cutting through the chain link. If I could climb onto the branch, I could avoid the barbed wire and drop down inside the perimeter. I waited until dusk, when visibility would be poor for both me and the infected. Using the fallen branch as planned, I carefully navigated over the fence and dropped silently onto the ground inside the compound. The 3 infected continued their mindless circuits, unaware of my presence as long as I remained still and silent. Their predictable movements created windows of opportunity. When all 3 were on the far side of the compound, I sprinted to the cinderblock building and tried the door. Locked, as expected, but the small window on the side was partially broken, likely from the same storm that had dropped the tree branch onto the fence. I carefully removed the remaining glass, creating an opening just large enough to squeeze through. The interior of the building was a technician's paradise. Broadcasting equipment, weather monitoring systems, radio gear, most of it intact, just dormant from lack of power. A backup generator stood in the corner, and a cursory inspection showed it had simply run out of fuel rather than malfunctioning. Most exciting of all was the solar array on the building's roof, with batteries for storage. The system was designed to provide emergency power during outages, enough to maintain essential functions. It took me 2 days to fully secure the compound. I eliminated the 3 infected using noise distractions and carefully timed strikes to their heads. I repaired the fence where the branch had damaged it. I cleared the building of any potential hazards and set up living quarters in the main control room, where I had access to all the equipment. The solar power system required some reconfiguration, but my engineering background made the task straightforward. By the end of the week, I had restored power to the essential monitoring equipment and some of the communication systems. The main transmitter required more power than the solar array could provide, but the emergency band radio worked perfectly, allowing me to both broadcast and receive on frequencies still used by any surviving governmental agencies or organized survivor groups. This facility became my permanent base, my observatory for both weather patterns and the world of the infected. The height of the tower provided an unmatched vantage point. I salvaged binoculars and a spotting scope from a nearby hunting supply store, giving me the ability to survey miles of surrounding territory. I mapped infected concentrations, tracked their movements, and correlated their behavior with changing weather conditions. The most significant discovery came during my 3rd week at the tower. A significant cold front moved through the area, dropping temperatures from the 80s into the low 50s. The effect on the infected was profound, beyond the sluggishness I'd already documented. Some of them simply stopped moving altogether, entering a state that resembled hibernation. They remained standing or slumped against structures, unresponsive even to stimuli that would normally trigger immediate reaction. This wasn't universal. Newer infected, those less decomposed, maintained some level of activity. But the older ones, those who had been transformed in the early days of the outbreak, appeared to have insufficient metabolic function to operate in the cold. This suggested that time itself might be a factor in eventually ending the threat. Nature was breaking them down, decomposition continuing despite their animated state. I documented everything meticulously, creating charts correlating temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and other variables with observed behavior. The pattern became increasingly clear. The infected were essentially weather-dependent predators. Their threat level could be predicted with reasonable accuracy based on atmospheric conditions. Heavy rain disoriented them, washing away the scent. Trails they seemed to follow and creating background noise that confused their hearing. Cold temperatures reduced their mobility and reaction times, with sufficiently low temperatures inducing a hibernation-like state in older specimens. High winds affected their already compromised balance. Bright sunlight seemed to impair their vision more than it did living humans. Nature has always found ways to contain its most destructive forces. Hurricanes lose power over land. Wildfires burn themselves out when they run out of fuel. Even the most devastating natural disasters eventually reach equilibrium. It appeared the same principle applied to the infected. Without fresh victims to replenish their numbers, they were slowly succumbing to the elements and the natural process of decay. With this knowledge, I began broadcasting daily on the emergency frequencies. I shared weather forecasts, correlating atmospheric conditions with predicted infected activity levels. I provided maps of safe travel corridors based on my observations. I explained techniques for using weather to advantage when scavenging or relocating. It was like hurricane advisories for the zombie apocalypse. For weeks, I received no response. I broadcast into emptiness, uncertain if anyone was receiving my transmissions. But I continued, driven by the same professional dedication that had made me a hurricane hunter. Information saves lives. Data matters. Someone, somewhere, might be listening. Then, exactly 2 months after the outbreak began, I received my first response. A weak signal, barely breaking through the static but unmistakably human. "This is Lakeline Mall Survivor Group. We receive your broadcasts. Your weather predictions have been accurate. Request direct communication with Weatherman. Over." I nearly fell out of my chair. After months of isolation, of talking to myself, of wondering if I was the only one left thinking scientifically about our situation, I had confirmation that others were not only surviving, but using my information to do so. I responded immediately, establishing a communication protocol with the Lakeline group. They were small, only 14 people who had secured the service corridors of the shopping mall, using the concrete structure as an effective barrier against the infected. They had been receiving my broadcast for nearly 3 weeks, using my weather-based predictions to time their scavenging runs. My information had directly contributed to their survival. Over the following weeks, more survivor groups made contact. A family farm near Georgetown with solar-powered ham, radio. A Texas Parks and Wildlife Station at Lake Travis. A community college biology department that had barricaded their building effectively. A military veteran who had established a safe house in an old fire station. Each had been following my broadcasts, using my weather zombie forecast to navigate their dangerous new reality. I modified my transmission schedule to include direct communication windows with each group, sharing information and coordinating observations. They became my network of weather stations, reporting local conditions and infected activity from their areas. With their data combined with mine, the forecasting models became increasingly accurate. For the first time since the outbreak, I felt I was making a difference, using my specialized knowledge to help others survive. My colleagues at NOAA had dismissed my concerns about atmospheric anomalies before the outbreak. Now survivors were alive because they listened to the weatherman. The network expanded gradually. Each new group that made contact often knew of others, creating a communication web that stretched across central Texas. We established protocols for assisting new survivors, for sharing resources, for warning about hostile groups that had formed. It wasn't government or military organization. It was ordinary people using information and cooperation to survive. 5 months into the outbreak, I received a transmission that changed everything. A group operating from Camp Mabry, the Texas Military Department headquarters in Northwest Austin, made contact. They weren't just survivors. They were organized military and scientific personnel who had maintained an operational base throughout the crisis. They had resources, security, and most importantly, researchers studying the infection. Their scientists had been monitoring atmospheric conditions as well, detecting the same anomalies I had observed before the outbreak. They had been receiving my broadcasts for months but had maintained communication security until they verified I wasn't a threat. Now they wanted to pool our research. The correlation between my weather data and their epidemiological findings was stunning. The atmospheric changes I'd detected weren't just coincidental to the outbreak. They appeared to be causally connected. The unusual barometric fluctuations preceded increases in the infection's spread rate. Temperature variations affected not just the infected's behavior, but the virus's transmission efficiency. This wasn't just valuable information for survival tactics. It was potentially the key to understanding the outbreak's origin and future. If atmospheric conditions influence the infection, then predicting weather patterns might allow us to predict changes in the threat itself. The implications were enormous. The Camp Mabry group proposed that I relocate to their facility, bringing my equipment and research. They had resources I lacked: laboratory facilities, trained personnel, protective equipment that would allow safer field research. I had data and observational experience they needed. Together, we might develop not just better survival strategies, but potentially find weaknesses in the infection itself. I agreed to consider their offer, but I wasn't ready to abandon the broadcasting tower that had become both my home and the central hub of the survivor network I'd established. I couldn't risk leaving the survivors who depended on my forecasts without that critical information, even temporarily. Instead, I proposed a compromise. I would maintain my position at the tower, continuing broadcasts to the network while sharing all my data with Camp Mabry. In return, they would provide me with better equipment, limited supplies, and regular updates on their research findings. It was a distributed research model, with my tower serving as an advanced observation post. They agreed, and within a week, a small team arrived with supplies and equipment. They brought solar panels to expand my power capacity, advanced weather, monitoring instruments far superior to my cobbled-together systems, and a satellite communication unit that allowed direct data transmission to their research team. They also brought something I hadn't seen in months: fresh food, medical supplies, and books on advanced meteorology and epidemiology to further my understanding. With these resources, I was able to expand my research dramatically. The more sophisticated equipment detected subtler atmospheric changes than my improvised systems could measure. The satellite link provided access to global weather data, allowing me to see patterns on a much larger scale. The improved power system let me run equipment continuously, gathering data around the clock. The patterns became increasingly clear. The infection wasn't just affected by weather. It was responding to global atmospheric conditions in ways that suggested it might be more than a simple virus. It behaved almost like a weather system itself, with incubation periods, active phases, and dormant cycles that correlated with specific atmospheric conditions. For the first time, I could see the patterns forming, not just of their movements, but of what was happening to our world. The virus and our atmosphere were engaged in a complex interaction, each influencing the other in ways we were only beginning to understand. It was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure, like watching a new type of storm system forming, one that operated on biological and meteorological levels simultaneously. 6 months into the apocalypse, I maintained my position at this broadcasting tower, continuing my research and coordination with both the Survivor Network and the Camp Mabry research team. Each day brings new data, new patterns, new understanding of the complex relationship between our altered atmosphere and the infection that has devastated humanity. The barometric anomalies that preceded the outbreak are appearing again, though in different patterns. Something is changing in our atmosphere, something that could affect the future of the infection and all surviving humans. With every broadcast, every data point, every observation, I work to ensure we're prepared for whatever comes next. This time, people are listening to the weatherman. Despite all my careful observations and predictive models, I almost died because of one simple miscalculation. It happened during my 4th month at the broadcasting tower, when I had become perhaps too confident in my understanding of infected behavior patterns and weather correlations. The tower's solar power system was efficient but limited. I needed additional panels to expand capacity, especially with the sophisticated equipment provided by Camp Mabry, drawing more power than my original setup. A big box home improvement store about 5 miles from the tower seemed the ideal target, likely to have solar equipment and less picked over than stores in more accessible areas. I planned the expedition meticulously, as I did all ventures. Outside the compound, weather conditions were favorable. A cold front had moved through the previous day, dropping temperatures into the low 60s, which would slow infected reactions. Cloud cover was moderate, reducing visibility for both me and them. Wind was from the northeast at 8 to 10 mph, enough to disperse scents but not so strong as to create noise that might mask their movements. According to my models, infected activity should have been at approximately 40% of baseline, a manageable risk level that had proven safe in previous excursions. I selected the optimal route, prepared my equipment, and set out at dawn when thermal differentials created ground fog that would provide additional concealment. Everything proceeded according to plan until I reached the store. The parking lot was largely clear, with only a few scattered infected visible, all exhibiting the sluggish movement I'd come to expect in cooler temperatures. I entered through a garden center side entrance, which my reconnaissance had shown to be minimally damaged and easily secured behind me. The interior was dim but navigable with my headlamp. I located the home energy section quickly and found exactly what I needed: solar panels, charge controllers, cabling, and even some instructional guides that might help optimize the system. I packed the equipment efficiently, keeping noise to a minimum, and prepared to exit the way I had entered. That's when everything went wrong. As I approached the garden center, I heard them. Not the familiar shambling and moaning of individual infected, but a sound I'd never encountered before. A synchronized movement of dozens, perhaps hundreds, with a rhythmic quality that sent chills down my spine. I extinguished my headlamp and moved carefully to a position where I could observe the garden center without exposing myself. What I saw defied everything I'd documented about infected behavior. A mass of them, at least 200, moved through the garden center in a coherent pattern, almost like a flock of birds or school of fish. They didn't bump into each other or wander aimlessly as isolated infected typically did. They moved as a unified entity, with coordination that suggested some form of communication I hadn't previously observed. Most disturbing of all was their activity level. Despite the cool temperatures that should have rendered them sluggish, they moved with the speed and responsiveness I associated with much warmer conditions. My weather-based prediction model had catastrophically failed. I retreated deeper into the store, searching for an alternative exit. The main entrance was not an option. It opened onto the front parking lot where the mass of infected was now flowing. The loading dock seemed promising until I discovered it was locked down with security shutters that would create tremendous noise if forced. I was effectively trapped, with limited supplies and no way to communicate my situation to the Survivor Network or Camp Mabry. For 3 hours I moved cautiously through the store, staying ahead of smaller groups that had broken off from the main mass to search the building. I observed their behavior, trying to understand what had changed, why my models had failed so completely. The temperature hadn't risen. No significant weather event had occurred. Yet they were behaving as if stimulated by some factor I hadn't accounted for. I found temporary refuge in a storage mezzanine above the contractor desk, accessible only by a ladder I could pull up behind me. From this vantage point, I could observe without being detected and try to formulate an escape plan. The situation seemed dire. My water would last perhaps 2 days, food for 3 if strictly rationed. The infected showed no signs of leaving. In fact, more seemed to be arriving hourly, drawn by some stimulus I couldn't identify. It was there, watching their movements from above, that I finally recognized a pattern. They were congregating most densely near the store's east wall, an area with nothing particularly attractive from a resource perspective. What the east wall did have, however, was proximity to a cell tower on the adjacent property. A hypothesis formed, one that connected to the atmospheric anomalies I'd been tracking. What if the infection responded not just to temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure, but to electromagnetic fields? The cell tower, though likely non-functional for communications, might still be emitting some form of radiation if its backup power systems were operational. If the infection had sensitivity to such emissions, it would explain both their unusual coordination and their heightened activity despite the cool temperatures. This theory, while scientifically intriguing, did nothing to improve my immediate survival prospects. I was still trapped. The infected were still numerous and unusually active, and my supplies were still limited. I needed intervention or an opportunity, and I had no way to create either. On the morning of the 3rd day, nearly delirious from lack of sleep, and rationed water, I heard something new. Gunfire, precise and disciplined, approaching the store from the west. Someone was engaging the infected and doing so with military efficiency. I risked moving to a window that offered a view of the parking lot. A group of 6 individuals in tactical gear was methodically clearing a path toward the main entrance, using suppressed weapons to minimize noise attraction. Their movement suggested professional training, and the efficiency with which they eliminated the infected indicated experience with the task. These weren't random survivors. This was an organized team with a specific objective. Given the timing and approach, I suspected it might be a rescue operation from Camp Mabry, responding to my failure to make scheduled radio contact. If so, they had no way of knowing my location within the massive store. I needed to signal them without attracting infected. Using my small signal mirror, I caught the morning sunlight and directed flashes toward the team in a pattern any military personnel would recognize as deliberate rather than random reflection. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in the oldest emergency code. The team leader noticed, adjusting their approach to move toward my position rather than the main entrance. They established a perimeter at a side door, eliminated the infected in the immediate vicinity, and breached the entrance with practiced coordination. Once inside, they used small infrared beacons to mark their path, technology that the infected couldn't perceive, but that allowed team members to maintain formation in the dim interior. I risked using my own small flashlight to signal my position from the mezzanine. Within minutes, they had secured the area beneath my position. "Weatherman?" The team leader called up, using my radio handle rather than my name. Confirmation this was indeed a Camp Mabry operation. I identified myself, and they quickly extracted me from the building, maintaining a disciplined tactical formation that kept the infected at bay. Their vehicle, an armored personnel carrier modified for silent operation, waited a quarter-mile away, with 2 additional personnel maintaining security. The extraction was successful, but I insisted on bringing the solar equipment I'd risked so much to acquire. The team leader initially refused, citing mission parameters focused solely on personnel recovery. I convinced her by explaining the equipment's importance to maintaining the early warning system that so many survivor groups now relied upon. Once secure in the vehicle, I learned that my rescue had been authorized not just because of my missed radio checks, but because of a critical development at Camp Mabry. The research team had identified anomalous atmospheric readings matching those I'd detected before the outbreak, but at greater intensity. Something significant was changing in our environment, and they needed my observational expertise to understand its implications for infected behavior. The team hadn't expected to find me alive after 3 days of silence. They certainly hadn't anticipated encountering the coordinated mass of infected that had trapped me. Both facts made my observations about the cell tower and potential electromagnetic sensitivity extremely valuable. As we traveled back toward my broadcasting tower, the team leader, Captain Diana Chen, formerly of the Texas Air National Guard, explained that similar masses of infected had been observed converging on specific locations throughout the region. The pattern had begun approximately 1 week earlier, coinciding with the atmospheric changes detected by Camp Mabry's instruments. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a systemic shift in infected behavior, potentially heralding a new phase of the outbreak. My narrow escape had provided critical first-hand observations of this phenomenon that might help understand and predict its development. Upon returning to the broadcasting tower, I discovered how close I had come to losing everything. A smaller group of infected, perhaps 50, had gathered at the perimeter fence. They hadn't breached it yet, but their coordinated efforts were methodically testing the structure, finding weak points with an intelligence that individual infected had never demonstrated. Without the Camp Mabry team's intervention, the fence would have failed within days, possibly hours. The team secured the compound, eliminated the infected at the perimeter, and reinforced vulnerable sections of the fence. 2 team members remained, stationed at the tower with me: Technical Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, a communications specialist, and Dr. Elaine Bennett, an atmospheric physicist from the research division. Their presence transformed the broadcasting tower from a solo observation post to a proper research outpost. With Dr. Bennett's expertise, and the additional equipment she brought, we were able to confirm my electromagnetic hypothesis. The infection appeared to be responding to specific frequency ranges, particularly those emitted by certain types of communications infrastructure. This explained both the congregation patterns and the heightened activity levels, despite unfavorable temperature conditions. More troubling were our findings regarding the atmospheric anomalies. The barometric fluctuations, temperature inversions, and unusual electromagnetic patterns were intensifying in ways that mirrored the pre-outbreak conditions I had observed. But this time, the changes were more pronounced, more structured, almost as if the atmosphere itself was developing some form of organization. Dr. Bennett's theory, supported by the Camp Mabry research team's findings, was both fascinating and terrifying. The infection might not be simply a biological agent affected by weather conditions. It might be actively influencing those conditions, creating a feedback loop that optimized the environment for its spread and survival. In essence, the infection might be terraforming our atmosphere, gradually altering it to better support its continued existence and evolution. The coordinated behavior of infected masses could be a manifestation of this process, an emergent system working toward environmental modification rather than just immediate predation. With this understanding, our forecasting models required complete recalibration. The relationship between weather conditions and infected behavior was bidirectional, each influencing the other in complex ways. The implications for survivor communities were profound. Weather patterns that had previously indicated low infected activity might now signal the opposite. Safe corridors might become deadly traps if we couldn't accurately predict these new behavioral patterns. I immediately revised my broadcasting protocols, sharing this critical information with all survivor groups in the network. Some were skeptical, particularly those who had established successful routines based on my previous forecasts. I understood their hesitation. Changes to survival strategies carried inherent risk. But the evidence was compelling, and most groups adjusted their operations accordingly. The most dramatic confirmation came 2 weeks after my rescue. A severe thunderstorm system moved through central Texas, bringing heavy rainfall and temperature, drops that, according to my original models, should have rendered the infected minimally active. Instead, survivor groups reported unprecedented coordinated movements, with infected masses flowing against prevailing winds toward specific convergence points. One such point was an electrical substation near a community college shelter housing 38 survivors. Based on our revised forecasts, I had warned them to evacuate despite the seemingly favorable weather conditions. Those who heeded the warning survived. Those who remained, trusting in the storm's protection as they had in the past, were overwhelmed when hundreds of infected breached their defenses with coordinated efficiency. The loss of the community college group was devastating, both emotionally and in terms of our survivor network. They had been a valuable node in our communication web, providing crucial local observations and supporting smaller groups in their area. Their fate served as a sobering reminder of how quickly our understanding could become outdated in this ever-evolving apocalypse. In the months since, we've continued refining our models, incorporating electromagnetic monitoring into our forecasting system. The Camp Mabry research team has expanded its work, establishing additional observation posts at key locations and developing potential countermeasures for the infected's new coordinated behavior. Most promising is their work on electromagnetic disruption. If the infected are indeed responding to specific frequency ranges, generating interfering signals might disrupt their coordination or even drive them away from critical areas. Early field tests have shown some success, though the power requirements for effective disruption currently limit its practical application. Our understanding of the atmospheric changes continues to develop as well. The alterations appear to be accelerating, with measurable shifts in oxygen-nitrogen ratios, particulate composition, and electromagnetic conductivity. The implications of these changes for long-term human survival remain uncertain. Will our atmosphere eventually become hostile to human life while supporting the infected? Is this an engineered outcome or an emergent property of the infection itself? These questions drive our ongoing research. Each day brings new data, new patterns, new challenges to overcome. The survivor network continues to grow despite occasional losses, with current estimates suggesting approximately 1,200 people connected to our communication web across Central Texas. Each contributes observations, each relies on our forecasts, each represents hope that humanity will endure. My role has evolved from solitary observer to coordinator of a distributed scientific effort. The broadcasting tower remains my primary base, but I now regularly consult with the Camp Mabry research team and occasionally visit other observation posts to calibrate equipment and methodologies. The weatherman has become not just a forecaster, but a symbol of how specialized knowledge can be adapted to serve survival in this transformed world. 6 months after the outbreak began, I find myself in a position I never anticipated. My concerns about atmospheric anomalies dismissed by colleagues at NOAA have proven not just valid but critically important to understanding our current reality. The hurricane hunter has become the zombie forecaster, tracking the movements of the infected with the same precision once applied to tropical storms. The barometric pressure is dropping again. The electromagnetic fields are strengthening in patterns we've learned to recognize as precursors to increased infected activity. Something significant is coming. Perhaps the most severe zombie weather event we've documented since the outbreak began. Our revised models project massive infected convergence on multiple points throughout the region, with coordination and efficiency beyond anything previously observed. But this time we're prepared. Survivor groups have been alerted, safe corridors have been identified, evacuation plans activated where necessary, electromagnetic disruptors deployed at critical locations. The Camp Mabry defensive perimeter has been reinforced with additional personnel and equipment. Nature has always found ways to contain its most destructive forces. Hurricanes lose power over land. Wildfires burn themselves out when they run out of fuel. Even the most devastating natural disasters eventually reach equilibrium. Perhaps this infection will follow the same pattern, ultimately burning itself out as the infected decompose faster than they can create new victims. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this is something entirely new, an evolutionary step we don't yet understand. The atmosphere continues to change. The infected continue to adapt. And we continue to observe, to document, to forecast, to survive. Something bigger is coming. The atmosphere is changing again. The patterns are clear to those who know how to read them. But this time, we'll be ready. This time, people are listening to the weatherman.